Hi, I'm Jonathan. I have crawled my way through the week of Christmas, New Year's, and being sick in order to coalesce into my office chair and bring a story for you fine folks. So if you like short stories in the horror, comedy, and sci-fi genres, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Tale-Teller's Universe. If you don't mind, do me a solid and please like, share, and subscribe so that you can get my stories on the regular. And none of that chat GPT stuff here, it's all out of my head. Anyway, let's get started with the story, and I hope you enjoy. Story called Shrooms by Jonathan Lee Wilson. What the hell, Tuesday? Silas Holloway said to his unsociable tabby cat. The feline had a habit of jumping out from a hiding spot and biting whatever exposed skin you were unfortunate enough to leave uncovered, like some psychotic jungle cat. The cat only did this when it was displeased. Generally, that meant whenever you were in the same room as him. Silas had made the mistake of having his foot exposed this time as he walked toward the kitchen. He swatted Tuesday and continued with his routine. Tuesday was a bit of a jerk, but he was Silas's responsibility for now. Besides, Tuesday was the only thing he had left of his on-again, off-again girlfriend, Cynthia. If she ever came back, and he was hopeful, he'd need to have her cat waiting for her. They were on a break, according to Cynthia. He felt like this was the Friends episode that would have been called one where she's probably dating other people while he babysits her asshole cat. He knew it was a little pathetic, but love makes you hold out for a chance at happiness. It was 6 weeks today that Cynthia moved in with a girlfriend from her work. At least they had been talking lately. Silas prepared a coffee and wandered out to the patio to take in the view. The property he lived on was a beautiful 150 acres in the woods of northern Kentucky. His parents, Frank and Colleen, had left it to him last year when they both passed away suddenly from an illness. First his father passed, and 2 weeks later his mother followed him to the grave. Frank Holloway was a pharmaceutical executive, ensuring that there was a sizable amount of cash to go along with the country property. Colleen Holloway was a free-spirited naturalist. She loved nature, and Silas had taken after his mother. The property he lived on was scenic and provided a certain level of comfort that his old apartment never could. His inheritance had given Silas the freedom to take a year off from work. At that time, he discovered he loved to cook. Any chance he could get, he would cook rather than eat out at a restaurant. It was more satisfying to do it himself. Not to mention, it was more economical, and he wanted to stretch that money as long as he could. One of the benefits of country living was having the space to grow your own food and forage for the rest. He'd recently taken up looking for wild mushrooms he could add to his meals. Frequently, Silas would go for walks on the property and find all kinds of interesting plants and herbs, even those not-so-legal kind. Today felt like a mushroom kind of day, he thought to himself. It was probably a good idea to get a look around, since last night's storm knocked over some old trees from what he could see out just off the porch. Silas knocked back the last of his coffee, took a deep breath, and went back inside. Tuesday decided it was time to be nice. After all, even disagreeable cats knew being nice was how you got treats and food. "Hey, Tuesday, how are you little shit?" he said as he grinned. The huge tabby cat stretched and then rubbed up against his leg. Silas poured some kibble in a bowl and changed his water. "I'm going for a walk to track down some mushrooms. You hold down the fort for me." Tuesday let out an unenthusiastic meow and continued eating his food. Silas donned his hiking gear. He had one of those knapsacks like Indiana Jones used to carry in the movies. He would imagine himself as a great explorer. He never could pull off the fedora, but the idea of being a world-renowned archaeologist/kick-butt adventurer always appealed to him. He slipped on his hiking boots, said goodbye to Tuesday, and headed out the door. It generally took about 40 minutes to walk the property. Things were still a bit damp from the last night's storm. A few trees had come down across the path Silas normally walked. This opened up an area normally inaccessible, unless you were a goat or some other rock-climbing creature. He'd never actually been in that part of the property before and was curious to see what he could find. So far, his mushroom hunt was a bust, and satisfying his curiosity was going to have to be the next best thing. Silas carefully traversed a couple logs and cleared the rocks until he was on the other side. About 30 feet past the rock wall was a strange-looking cluster of what appeared to be mushrooms. These mushrooms were unique. He'd never seen anything like them. It was like a mound the size of a bowling ball was half buried in the ground, and from this round structure grew mushrooms on stalks 3 feet high. "Holy shit, what is that?" he said out loud. Could this be an entirely new species of mushrooms? "I need to show Vern," he said of his friend, the biologist who worked at the local college. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a penknife. It wasn't much of a knife, but after all, he didn't need much of a knife. He grabbed a handful of mushroom tops and cut the stems about 4 inches down. It was like he had a bouquet of fungus roses. From the cuts exuded a small amount of liquid. The smell coming from it was something he'd never smelled before. It was actually very pleasant. It made his mouth water like a starving man at an all-you-can-eat buffet. For a moment he thought about tasting it, but then decided it probably was not best to do that. Silas placed his samples into his Indiana Jones bag and patted it once he closed the top. "This is my lucky day. I had a little adventure and got some crazy new species of mushrooms," he thought to himself. He hadn't actually been out that long, but he suddenly felt like he needed to run home. He was very curious about these mushrooms. He had no idea whether they were toxic or the most delicious mushrooms you could eat. For all he knew, they smelled great but tasted like crap. When he arrived home, Tuesday was sitting in front of the door disapprovingly. This was usually the case unless he came home with something for Tuesday specifically. Silas kicked off his boots in a frenzy and rushed to the kitchen. He took out his prize from his bag and laid it on the kitchen counter. He stared at it for a couple of minutes, trying to decide what he should do. Finally, he decided to contact Vern and see what he had to say. Silas and Vern had been friends for many years. They had both taken some college courses together. Vern went on to do great things and was mostly a big fish in a small pond at this point in his life. Both of them had an affinity for board games and old movies. Occasionally, they would get together and have a game and movie night. Vern had been around for the Cynthia years. He secretly was glad that time was over for Silas. Silas hit number 2 on speed dial and called Vern. Number 1 was reserved for Mr. Chow's takeout. You had to know where your priorities lay, and Chinese food was great. It was the one thing Silas was not proficient at making. Vern picked up on the third ring. "Hey Silas, how's life treating you this week?" he said right away. "Not bad. Is Emily still riding your ass? She never did know when to leave well enough alone." "You know me. I'm too slippery for my supervisor to get a saddle on my back. What's up, man?" "I know you're a botanist, but I was wondering if you ever deal with mushrooms in your line of work." "Well, I have a passing knowledge of mushrooms. That's a mycologist thing. But I might be able to answer some questions if that's what you're asking," he said, clicking his ballpoint pen. Vern had a habit of fidgeting with his pen when he was on the phone. "Good enough for me. I found a new kind of mushroom on the back of my property. It's like nothing I've ever seen. Even Google comes up empty," Silas said excitedly. Silas was petting Tuesday when the feline decided to hiss and bite his hand. He never wanted this cat. It was Cynthia's idea to get a cat. She was the one who decided naming your cat after the day you brought it home was a good idea. "I'm really swamped right now, but if you can wait until next week, I'd be happy to check out what you found," Vern said as he fumbled the pen and it landed in his coffee mug, full of a fresh cup. "Ah, crap, I gotta go. Just sent coffee all over my paperwork. 1 week. I'll come check out what you found," he said, and he hung up the phone. Silas decided it was time for meal prep. Tonight was a lasagna night. Sauce courtesy of his own personal stock of fresh off-the-vine tomatoes and herbs just picked from the garden. He had an urge to look at the mushrooms one more time. They smelled amazing. He rolled them back and forth in the palm of his hand and took in an even bigger whiff. He placed the mushrooms back in the satchel and set them aside. Silas, like many cooks, had the habit of tasting as he prepared a meal. Whether it was forgetfulness or distraction, he neglected to wash his hands after handling the mushrooms. For some reason, the lasagna was the best he'd ever eaten, hands down. Silas woke up the next morning with a splitting headache. He shuffled from his bedroom to the bathroom and splashed water on his face. The circles under his eyes were deep and dark. He made his way to the kitchen for his usual coffee, and the smell of the mushrooms hit his nose hard. He suddenly had an uncontrollable urge to have a taste. He ran to the satchel and tore into them. He felt like everything was more vivid. He felt more alive in that moment than he'd been his whole life. Were these some kind of magic mushrooms? Was he tripping balls right now? No matter, he liked it. Next meal he prepared was spaghetti with mushroom sauce. After that, mushroom pizza. By the end of the week, he hardly had anything to show Vern when it was time for his arrival. Silas made a trip to the secret spot and harvested more mushrooms, as much as he could carry in his bag. When he returned home, the phone was ringing. He let it go to voicemail. Cynthia was hoping to visit Tuesday over the weekend. He couldn't be bothered with such unimportant things right now. He got right back to work on his next meal prep. A few hours later, the phone rang again and Vern was on the line. "Are we still on for meeting up? I'm really curious about these mushrooms you told me about," said Vern. Yeah. Drop by tomorrow morning. I'll show you what I got and take you to the place I found them. You've got to try these things," he said like some meth addict jonesing for a fix. "You ate them already? You do realize some mushrooms are toxic or hallucinogenic at least," said Vern, worried about his friend. "I'm fine, never felt better," said Silas. "Okay, well, I'll see you tomorrow anyway. 9 o'clock sharp. Talk to you later," said Vern as he hung up the phone. Silas placed the phone on the counter. He sneezed and a glob of grayish-black fluid aerosolized across the counter and cabinets. He was exhausted and needed to go back to bed, even though it was still early in the day. He felt like he'd ran a marathon. He shook his head, noticed the fluid, and quickly wiped it up. He should have been concerned. Any normal person would have been concerned. However, right now, he was definitely not normal. He grabbed his phone and stumbled toward the bedroom. Tuesday came in for an attack, nearly toppling him to the floor. His ankle bled from the bite combined with stumbling over Tuesday. The feline stopped, looked behind Silas, hissed, and ran away. Vern pulled up to Silas's road. He had been enjoying some classic rock on the radio station. It had been a busy week, and he was looking forward to hanging out with his good friend. Part of him was really excited at the prospect of a new discovery. Vern brought a fresh coffee for both of them. He might have gotten a head start. He glanced down at the 2 cups and thought about pouring a little from one to the other just to level them out a little. He decided it was best to just hand Silas a full cup and pretend he hadn't already drunk 3/4 of his already. Vern pulled up to the deck and came to a stop. "Silas, I'm here," he yelled out. Nothing. No noise came from the house. It was quiet as a tomb. He exited his Prius and made his way up the stairs. Vern was a little jealous of the house that Mr. and Mrs. Holloway had left their son. All Vern got from his parents was a pat on the back, a thumbs up at graduation, and a $100 Walmart gift card. "Hey Silas, open up, brought you a coffee," he said as he knocked on the door with the back of his hand. The door creaked open with a slight push. Vern poked his head in the door and looked around. It was dark inside. Most of the windows had the curtains drawn. The ones that didn't have curtains were covered in towels, blankets, and fitted sheets. One window even had a couple of old pizza boxes jammed into the frame. The house was more humid than he remembered it being before. The countertops glistened with condensate. In the darkness, he could see a shape on the couch. "Silas, is that you?" he asked softly. The shape on the couch shifted as Vern approached. He reached out slowly to touch the gray blanket. As soon as his fingers touched the fabric, Tuesday burst from the couch, leaping up and over Vern's shoulder. Vern could hear boxes overturning as Tuesday made a hasty retreat. Laying under the blanket was Silas. Vern reached over and turned on the table lamp next to the couch. The light from the bulb cast a sickly yellow glow on Silas's skin. "Good God, what happened to you?" Vern said, backing up slightly. Silas's eyes opened weakly, and he stared back at Vern. Silas rubbed his eyes with his sleeve and ran fingers through his hair. "I think I'm sick," he said softly. "What was your first clue? Why didn't you call me sooner? You look half dead. I'm worried about you." Vern went to the tap and filled a glass half full. Bringing it to his clearly ailing friend, he said, "Here, drink some water, man." Nodding in agreement, Silas took a sip of water. He coughed some and drank the rest. "Thanks. Feels a little better," he said. Silas got up carefully and turned on another lamp. Vern could really see how pale and clammy his friend was now that the lighting was better. "Why is it so dark in here? Plus, it's so humid. Are you trying to live in a cave or something?" Vern asked. I don't know. It just felt right. I think I'm okay now. I really want to show you those mushrooms." He got a sudden burst of speed and rushed to the counter where his satchel lay. He fumbled through the bag and found it was completely empty. Not a scrap of the mushrooms remained. He looked around in a bit of panic and looked back at Vern. I seem to have used up my supply. Be happy to take you where I found them. There's a ton of them out there," he said as he pulled the satchel over his shoulder. Silas seemed strangely energized, especially when compared to how he felt only minutes ago. He picked up the coffee from the counter that Vern had brought him and drank it down and headed for his boots. Vern turned to watch him in stunned silence. "Well, okay, I guess we're going now?" Silas pulled the door open and called behind him, "Make sure the door latches. I'll meet you on the driveway." Vern looked around confused and drained the remaining coffee from his cup. He tossed a disposable cup in the trash near the door and headed out to follow his obviously sick friend. As soon as he stepped off the deck, Silas thrust a folding camper shovel into his hand. Now they were both ready. Silas knew his friend would love what these mushrooms could do for you. Sure, he needed more mushrooms to get that feeling, but there were more and more mushrooms every time he visited the secret spot. It was like they grew back stronger than before. Silas could almost walk this trail with his eyes closed. It wasn't so much a familiarity with his property. It was a sense of being drawn to the mushrooms. The scent to him was more powerful than anything he'd known before. He increased his speed and Vern was having trouble keeping up. "Slow down. It's not a race, man. You're clearly sick. You have some energy back, but you still look like poop on a stick, dude," he said with some labored breathing as they power walked up the pathway. "Don't be such a slowpoke, Vern. A few less donuts in the lab and you could beat me in a race," he said as he made the turn at the fallen trees. They had arrived at the secret spot, as Silas liked to call it. The area was foggy as it was still only mid-morning. "What did I tell you? These mushrooms are like nothing you've ever seen before, right?" "Yeah, I'll say. You definitely found something amazing," Vern said as he surveyed the area. The ball-like grouping was shuddering slightly. Nearly 10 times as many mushrooms now extended from it and the surrounding area. "I want to get some photos of this," said Vern as he pulled out his smartphone and started snapping away. Once he seemed content with the images captured, he studied the ball and decided he wanted a sample. Everything seemed to originate from that spot. Silas, however, could simply not resist the smell of the mushrooms and started feeding like some kind of beast. Gray-black fluid oozed from his mouth as he chewed furiously. Vern took out some snips like you'd use to trim flowers and cut a large sample from the ball. I want to get this I want to get this under a microscope and see what's going on. You're acting very strange, and I'm concerned these mushrooms are harming you," Vern said as he placed the samples into a plastic zipper bag he produced from his pocket. "I think I need to dig up the ball and see what's underneath." He unfolded the shovel and placed it at the edge of where the ball met the ground. Vern watched his friend eating mushrooms like they were going out of style. It was kind of disturbing. It brought to mind an Old Testament story about a Babylonian king who went crazy and ate grass on all fours and lived outside for 7 years. He shook his head and diverted his attention back to the circular portion of the mushrooms. "Do you think you could help me with this?" he asked Silas. Suddenly, Silas realized what was happening. Vern wanted all of this for himself. It was his, and no one would dig up these mushrooms and take them away. Silas's eyes went milky white and something snapped in his mind. He lost his humanity, and only what he wanted remained. Vern was struggling to get the shovel to find purchase in the soil. He rocked the shovel back and forth, and it made a pop noise and spores flooded the ground. At that moment, Vern failed to see what was going on behind him. Vern gasped as the shovel belonging to Silas struck him across the back of his skull. His eyes rolled into the back of his head, and he collapsed to the ground. Above Vern stood Silas. No one, not even his friend, would take the only thing that mattered anymore. Silas cocked his head to the side like a confused puppy and looked down at his best friend of 15 years. Vern let out a groan and reached around to feel the warm blood oozing from his scalp. Silas drew back the shovel and hit Vern so many times with the edge of the shovel that he split his head open like an overripe watermelon. The rounded portion of the mushroom shuddered and began to move. It separated from the ground and revealed a mud-encrusted face. It was missing one eye, and its nose was short as if from a skull. Black slime poured from the eye socket and open nostrils. An arm neither Silas nor Vern had noticed before shot out from the ground and grabbed Silas by the ankle and sent Silas crashing to the ground himself. The creature simply held him in place and moved no further. Silas's energy was gone. All the fight left him and had gone into the murder of his best friend. This is where Silas would stay. If someone was alive to see where he lay, they would see 2 bowling ball-sized mounds half buried into the ground and large stalks of mushrooms growing out from both. Cynthia was beginning to worry. It was unusual not to hear from Silas for this long. He didn't answer all week, and she was supposed to visit Tuesday over the weekend. Well, whether Silas was pissed at her or not, she had a right to see her cat. They had an arrangement, and she would not let her weirdo ex mess things up. She tried his cell one more time, and then made the drive over. Both Silas's car and his nerd friend Vern's car were parked outside. This was probably for the best. Having Vern there meant she could visit her cat and not have to worry about conversation about nature and tree hugging with Silas for hours. "Si, I'm here to see Tuesday. I just want to see my cat." She knocked repeatedly on the door. He was so frustrating, she thought to herself. Slowly, she turned the latch and opened the door. "I know you're in here. Vern, too. Both your cars are parked in the drive." It was so dark in here. It smelled weird, too, like a cave or the inside of a rotting log. "Fine, whatever. Tuesday, honey, where are you?" she said as she went for the lamp next to the couch. She reached for the chain, and Tuesday leaped up and sank his teeth deep into her hand. She screamed and knocked over the lamp, sending it crashing to the floor and into several pieces. "It's just me, Tuesday. What has Si done to you to make you bite me? You never bite me." She was cradling her hand now. Blood was rapidly dripping onto the carpet. "That hurt. I even brought you some treats," she said, looking around. She knew her cat was an asshole, but he never acted that way toward her. She'd never been bitten so hard by any animal, let alone her pet. Under a nearby chair, two glowing red flames peered out. Cynthia walked slowly around the room trying to locate her cat. She found him all right. His claws tore 3 crimson strips of ragged flesh from her calf muscle. The sudden pain caught Cynthia off guard, and she smashed down on top of a glass coffee table behind her. Glass shattered and went everywhere, including her knees, thighs, and buttocks. She yelled as the intense burning sensation hit her like a baseball bat. Tuesday looked at her and flicked his tail in anger and annoyance. The look on his face was that of hate. Cynthia was terrified. She loved her cat, but not this version that clearly wanted to kill her. Tuesday set up for the pounce. He had in mind to sink his claws and teeth into the woman's neck and quiet her for good. His muscles tensed like a spring and he released, leaping straight at the woman's neck. Reacting with surprising speed, Cynthia pulled a shard of glass from the table, up just in time to intersect with the leaping Tuesday. This caused Tuesday to sail over Cynthia's head and crash into the wall behind her. Tuesday landed and didn't move. She began crying and dropped the bloody glass shard. Slowly and painfully, she got up from the floor and found the light switch to turn on all the house lights. What just happened? She asked herself. This was not how she planned this evening in her head. She shuffled over to the body of her insane cat. There was blood, as you would expect, but something else she couldn't explain. Where the cat was cut with the glass, with a strange black fluid that pooled beside the body. Wherever Silas was, he would have a lot of explaining to do. She needed to get herself to the ER now. She'd never be able to pull all this glass out on her own, and that was a nasty bite on her hand. She looked around the room and then closed the door behind her, crying as she went. The room went silent, save for a growling, growling noise coming from Tuesday. Slowly, Tuesday opened one eye and licked his chops. And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed my mushroom story. Think I'll go have some pizza now. Extra mushrooms. No one better take my slice of pizza. No one takes my mushrooms away. If you like stories like this, original stories, please like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the algorithm. I would like to be able to have a larger audience so I can bring more of my little creations to people just like you. I hope that your 2025 is better than your 2024. And I'll catch you next time. Come back soon. I'll be waiting.